I was invited by ETH, and thank you ETH for the invitation and for setting up this great event series, to talk about spatial cognition and architecture, from evidence to design. I'm a psychologist by training. I work at ETH Zürich under the label of cognitive science, and our team is looking at applying principles from psychology and other behavioral sciences to different disciplines. Most of the time we work with disciplines such as computer science, engineering, finance. But for the past 15 years we've also developed a research strand that interacts very heavily with architects and urban planners, that interacts very heavily with people who either are still at UCL or have been at UCL in the past. And you will see, if you have any relations to people in this building, quite a few things that you might consider familiar. So my background for the purpose here is spatial cognition, but my other background is human-computer interaction. And what I'm basically arguing is that the way that the behavioral sciences have learned to treat the interaction between humans and computers in a very detailed and productive fashion is something that is still lacking in architecture and urban planning, and that some of the approaches that make the user interface of the digital device that you have somewhere in your pocket easy to use, which is the stuff that is discussed in science as usability and user interface design and user experience, that all that logic can be brought into architecture. I only have 20 minutes today, so I can only scratch the surface of that, but I wanted to give that as a starting point for what we're doing. So I have the privilege of working both in Zurich and Singapore, two places that are very similar in many respects and very different in many others. For example, the Swiss are highly allergic to high-rise buildings or densified living conditions, right? They're always afraid that it's like packing too many rats in a cage, and that's what urban densification is to them. And then you go to Singapore, which is basically a country that is the same population as Switzerland, except on the surface of Lake Geneva. And then you have this guy who founded a country who is so totally into trees that he reserves as much as possible of the Singaporean footprint for trees, right? So as a consequence, there's always high-rise living and densification. There's also a very modernist way of doing transport, so roads rock, right? So that further densifies. And that gives us really the opportunity to study urban life and behavior and experience inside of built space in two locations that are vastly different. This picture, by the way, is from Hong Kong, because Hong Kong is one of those locations that we then look at from Singapore and telling ourselves, well, Singapore isn't that bad, right? Because Hong Kong is 3 or 4 times more dense, and you can do even more interesting studies there. So I'll very briefly talk about us. I'll talk about the scope of our research. I'll talk about the approach that we're taking. And I hope I can also show you a few case studies. So I'm just a spokesperson, right? So I'm one of the psychologists in the team, but the kind of work that we do relies on having a highly multidisciplinary team. In our team we have architects, we have people with urban planning degrees, we have people with geography degrees, we have people with neuroscience degrees, and several types of computer scientists. And they all work together to help us understand how humans behave in the built environment, how that behavior relates to certain features of the built environment, in the hope that ultimately we can make some causal inferences, to follow your logic, some causal inferences about behaviors and perception and the relation to space, so that we can at some point make meaningful predictions about how yet unbuilt space will influence the human perception, behavior, and experience. Within the Future Cities Laboratory in Singapore, we're looking at livable cities, or at making cities more livable. And we're focusing on 2 large families of research topics. One is urban mobility. Urban mobility is about how we move about the built environment at the macro scale. Do we go with the public transport? Do we go in a car? Do we go cycling? And yes, as crazy as that may sound, there are people in Singapore who cycle, right? It's a bit like 25 years ago when I was first coming to London. There was very little cycling, and people have somehow picked up cycling in this city despite the fact that the air isn't that good and that cars are crazy and you kill cyclists all the time, right? But somehow cycling made it. In Singapore, the average daily temperature is 31 degrees. The average nighttime temperature is 24 degrees, and humidity is almost always 100%. But cycling is still fun, except you need a shower when you arrive in the office, right? And there's all sorts of research that you can do in that direction. I'm not going to go much deeper into that. But likewise, these same climatic circumstances also make walking outside at urban scale non-trivial. And how do you design an urban environment to make it attractive enough on several dimensions to entice walking? Because there's one thing that everybody is agreeing about in Switzerland, in Singapore, and probably also in the UK, namely we need to have fewer people traveling in cars, especially those cars with combustion engines, right? But let's set that aside. Let's get smaller, get more into architectural space of buildings. And that is what our other team is focusing on cognition and architectural experience is looking at. We look at pre-occupancy evaluation as opposed to post-occupancy evaluation. So we try to evaluate buildings before they are even implemented. This is where stuff like virtual reality comes in. We look at usability. We try to infuse evidence-based approaches into design processes. We look at healthy aging. We look at differences that people have in cognitive abilities. We generally look at the user experience, not the user experience of your mobile device, but the user experience of traversing from the entrance of this building into here and back out again, hopefully after we've all had a nice drink. And we also look at pedestrian comfort. And in an environment like Singapore, pedestrian comfort very often means indoor pedestrian comfort. So just to give you the smallest possible 2-minute sketch of how we do this, let's look at our research methods. The vast majority of our research starts with not only asking people, but looking at people. We give people a task. We expose them to an interestingly complex built environment, often a publicly accessible building, like an airport or a train station or a hospital or a shopping mall. And in Singapore, very often you have a hospital that's directly connected to a shopping mall, and underneath of it is a train station, right? So, which immediately gives you a degree of spatial complexity that makes your architectural heart open up and bloom, right? So we expose people to these environments, and we give them tasks like, hey, find your way from A to B. Spend 30 minutes here, familiarize yourself with the space, tell me what you like and what you don't like, and hey, maybe I'll ask you to draw a map of the environment afterwards. Those kind of tasks. And we look at how good are people at that. And that's psychologically interesting because there's a vast variability in people's ability to handle those tasks. But for the purposes of what I have to talk about today, we are interested in what are the spatial determinants of what makes it easy or difficult for people to solve these tasks. And these are not tasks that we just make up out of the evilness of being behavior scientists. No, we of course base them on what you would have to normally do, right? So you arrive with the subway and you have to find yourself to the hospital, or you have to find your way to shopping, or whatever it is you want to do. And so that's the kind of task that we replicate. Investigating wayfinding the built environment is fun, but of course from a scientific point of view, it has limitations. It has limitations that are strongly linked to how architectural design works, right? Architectural design is not an analytic discipline that systematically investigates all possible combinations of spatial features, because that is what you would do if you want to understand what is the causal relationship between space and people. But that's not how you design. That would be stupid for designing. You follow a certain set of design ideas and then you build a case. And any case of design is different from any other case of design on more than one dimension, thus making causal inference really difficult. How do we solve this, right? Ideally, we find ourselves a sponsor that allows us to build the same building twice with just the minute differentiation that we want to investigate. You all have prejudice about Switzerland being crazy rich, right? And maybe similar prejudice about Singapore. Let me assure you, none of those countries is giving us the budget to do that, right? So we have to do something else. What do? Well, we do technology. One approach that we can do is virtual reality simulation, right? With the advent of BIM becoming more and more feasible and practical and sometimes even required, right? There's more and more competence to get high-level, high-quality virtual reality simulations, and those can be a building ground for systematic comparisons that allow you to find out whether one version or the other of a building is better. The whole area of human-computer interaction does this under the label of A/B testing. There's all this famous work from Google on figuring out which shade of blue is the best for a link color, right? That's basically the same logic, except that we do it on maybe architecturally more meaningful comparisons, but still the same logic. You test something in a simulation with real humans and find out how they respond to it. That's one family of approaches. That's what's mentioned here under wayfinding studies in virtual environments. The third approach is to use agent-based models and computational tools. The idea here is that you, in the computer, like in a simulation of a video game, where you have those non-player characters that do all sorts of stuff, you simulate yourself a world with inhabitants. And you instill those inhabitants with certain properties, abilities to form a cognitive map, an understanding of the world around them, memories, perceptions, decision-making. And then you fill your world with lots and lots of these agents, and then you look at the behavior. In certain areas of architectural design, this is common. For example, in the simulation of train stations or airports, that's what typically happens. The challenge is that all the major pieces of software that are used to, for example, simulate passengers in airports make funny assumptions. The funniest assumption is that they assume that every passenger in the airport always knows exactly where they want to go and how to get there, right? So in an airport simulation, nobody ever gets lost. I always get lost. Don't you get lost in airports, right? Especially if you go to Frankfurt Airport. We've done research at Frankfurt Airport, and it's easy to get lost there, right? So, and as behavior scientists, we then go in and take these engineering models and start asking questions. What happens if we give them less than perfect vision? What is if we give them less than perfect memory? What happens if we give them less than perfect decision-making abilities? Less than perfect being human-like, right? And suddenly you find different patterns, and suddenly you can investigate stuff such as, well, would it help if the signage was better to guide people along, right? Because in the original models, all the agents were perfect. They don't need to look at signs. They know what to do, right? And those are the kinds of changes that you have to make to agent-based models to make them meaningful from a psychological point of view. And the fourth family of approaches that we take is we do spatial analysis. And of course, this is UCL, right? The most successful or most widely used method of spatial analysis probably is space syntax, originating from UCL. And of course, we also do space syntax. We have opinions about some of it. Most of the time, we're very happy with it. Some of the time, we build small extensions. And it has proven for the kinds of questions that we have to be highly predictive. And often even highly predictive in circumstances where I felt, no, this is not going to work. So I'm a big fan of space syntax, still, after all these years. Let me try to position a little bit more what we're doing. So the research literature on spatial cognition and architectural design has grown considerably in the last 10, 15 years. And a standard model would assume that, well, one of the big things to look at is how do people build cognitive maps. Cognitive maps is what Kate already briefly alluded to, the ability to form a spatial representation somewhere in your brain or mind of how the space around you is arranged. People differ strongly in their ability to make such representations. It is also the case that people have very strong individual differences in what strategies they use to get to a building. Some people orient more on landmarks. Some really build a map in their heads, if you will. Some memorize routes. And there's a relation between features of the building and people's ability to memorize them. If you're more into landmarks, you need a landmark-rich building. If you're more into maps, you need a simple-to-map structure. Right? Some of us are blessed and they can do all of that. Some of us, like me, are a bit less blessed and struggle more. But the third most important ingredient really in this research is to look at the environment itself. What are the properties of the environment? What are the environmental features? These are the three families of determining factors if you want to predict how good are people at navigating an environment. What we have now over the last few years, and that is the main thrust of our research right now, especially in Singapore, trying to do is add three more dimensions. One is what I already alluded to, namely social density and crowding. Does it make a difference whether the building is empty, right? If you look at architecture photography, there's hardly anybody in the way, right? If you're in the subway this afternoon in rush hour, there's lots of people, right? Does that make a difference? Does that make a difference for the navigation decisions that you make? Very likely. Does it make a difference for the other topic that I would like to mention, namely to your emotional response? Very likely, right? And then there's a third topic that we are increasingly looking at now that we work on 2 continents and work in a highly multicultural society like Singapore. We look at cultural differences. There's some literature that suggests that people with an Asian background might have different strategies in representing space. Okay. But there's still a lot to be done to understand what people's attitudes and cultural backgrounds mean for how they deal with different types of spaces. So that's our research program, that's our framework. What we really try to introduce is different types of evidence that might, at different stages of design, be helpful for making design decisions that help people better navigate the environment and feel more happy about it. Right? I have a few more minutes, so I'll show you a few examples. 2 of those are what we've done a lot of research on. One is proper architecture, the other is not so proper architecture. I hope you will all agree that what Reem Koolhaas does is proper architecture, even if you don't like him. So the Seattle Public Library, done by OMA and mostly by Joshua Prince Ramus probably, is a building that invites research on patron satisfaction, right? So it got lots of prizes. It's a great building, right? It's an amazing sculpture, especially if you happen to have blue skies in Seattle, which you do not have every day, right? But also from the inside, OMA has done a lot of work about the user experience and planning with the user in mind. We've done a lot of research about this building, and we found a lot of flaws, but I have to frame this as they really did a great job. Right? So the Seattle Public Library was supposed to be a library for the 21st century, rethinking functionality and all that. And in many ways, it's really great. And it communicates very nicely. Right? So if you talk about user experience and about a building communicating with its user in terms of navigation, right? How much more can you communicate than paint the escalator bright yellow? Right? It says, ride me, right? Explore the building. Right? And that's what people do. But then there's challenges. And with space syntax, you can very nicely describe those challenges because, for example, in this picture here, right, you can see the books, right? But how do you get to the bloody books, right? And in space syntax, that is the difference between walkability and visibility. And yes, this mismatch is a great cause of navigation difficulties in this building, right? There's other great things about the Seattle Public Library, like this book spiral that sounds like the spiral in the Guggenheim Museum. In fact, it is not a spiral, it is squarish, right? But when you walk to the very bottom of it, right, it doesn't continue. There's actually a printed sign that says you have reached the end of the book spiral, turn around. You had that in your talk on Monday, right? So we've done some research on what do people say about it. And they say, well, I found the ever-narrowing floating escalators to be frightening and left the building as soon as I could figure out how to get out. Right? That's psychology at its best. Right? And also, I really like Joshua Prince-Ramus. He's a great guy. He does amazing TED Talks. He really thinks about users. I'm sure he likes psychologists, right? So I also have to like him. And there's a quote that's attributed to him that really sums it up, right? So they thought about the user a lot, right? And they did this nice design with the boxes that were shifted around. But, well, they thought it's easy. But what they afterwards find out, well, it's not easy for normal people to understand this building, right? And that is where this whole notion of you need evidence about what people do if you want people to behave in a certain way, in this case, not get lost. So maybe talking to psychologists every once in a while might help. There's really good analytic work on why the library is difficult, and I invite you to read a book that Ruth Dalton and I edited that has lots of examples of that. But also, more importantly, and again, building on top of what Kate has said, we're interested in data, right? So we collect a lot of data of how people move through this building. For example, we make them find this section of non-fiction DVDs, right? And, well, it's actually very simple. Right? So you would just have to follow the dotted line. And if everybody understood where those DVDs are, they would follow the dotted line. What's the data? They're all over the place, right? Except not where they're supposed to be. So people are confused. And I could show you tons of more of these examples. Right? Another building that we've looked at quite a bit, we have done more than half a dozen studies, is this building in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of Germany, a conference center. We've done all sorts of analytics on it and looked at how do people get lost in there. And it turns out this is mostly the case because the internal vertical structure of the building is really weird. Many of you, if you've ever seen space syntax, have probably seen analyses like this, which turn the structure of a building into a graph network, and then you can do all these nice graph theoretic analyses of proximity and centrality and integration and intelligibility of buildings. And it turns out that all of these features are highly predictive of where people will go in the building and where in the building they will get lost. Right? And the other level of analysis that proves to be very helpful here is what's called isovist analysis, looking at visibility. And our tiny little agent, the white dot here, right? If that little agent moves through the building, we can follow him and see what they're seeing. And it turns out they have to move around quite a bit before they can start to understand the building, especially the vertical structure. And so again, here, space syntax is highly predictive of why people fail. Right? And if you look at the floor plan of this simple building being completely crazy in terms of its internal circulation, you understand that people get lost. And again, space syntax can very nicely predict exactly what people do. Namely, if they are not familiar with the building, they stick to the central bits of the building. And that is what hinders them from exploring more of it. This is maybe the worst example of virtual reality ever, because it's butt ugly. But that's partly because we are doing a very good job of replicating a 1970s church-owned building in the middle of nowhere in the middle of Germany, right? So actually the left-hand side is what it looks like, except more pixelated, right? But what happens if you do something architectural about it? Like you cut in a big atrium, right? The church isn't going to pay for that. But if you cut in a big atrium, what happens? Well, we did the virtual reality studies, and what we find is that people's perception of the space changes completely. Right? It becomes more spacious, doesn't become more beautiful, but people's understanding of, oh, there is a central staircase. Now I understand how I can navigate in this building. And they make much fewer navigation errors. That's the kind of things that you can get with these kinds of analyses. And of course, you can do this in architecturally more meaningful buildings, like the Seattle Public Library, right? And this nice concrete wall here, which probably as architects you love, right? For the non-architect, it hides where the elevators are, because normal people don't understand that, well, this big structure is where the elevators would be. This helps me to get through the building, right? And now we can do experiments where we have one-way versus two-way elevators and those kinds of architectural features. I have lots more examples on my computer, but I've already overrun my time because I always talk too much. I hope you found this slightly entertaining, and now it's Kerstin's time.